Hey everyone, welcome back to Musky Town's Time with the Pros. We have a special guest for you on this episode, Joe Goodspeed. Joe is one of the more innovative tyers in musky fly fishing. There's quite a few people who are innovative, but he has a very unique style, and anyone who's seen one of Joe's flies will recognize them. Will recognize what we're looking at here instantly. But Joe, welcome to Time with the Pros.
Thanks, Adam.
What are you planning to share with us tonight?
So I am going to talk about the single shank pattern flies that I have a whole bunch of different looking flies, but pretty much all of the flies that I catch muskies on are based on the same, the longest big game shank. It's about just under 4-inch long, heavy diameter wire shank with a loop on both ends, and that within that one single shank, I think you can do a world of musky tying stuff. You know, you can create all kinds of presentation effects by everything that you can build around on a single shank. So, you know, I will try to describe some of my theories about the you know, so many people are building things that are game changer style flies that have a whole bunch of moving pieces, and I believe that you can make flies that can easily compete with what those flies might do for hooking and landing fish on a single shank. And so I've got some ideas that all go towards what sort of fly appearance to the fish, present rigging and presentation styles that work with these certain flies that go hand in hand to catch those fish.
That's awesome. And for anyone who's wondering, we're doing a little bit different style of video on this episode. Joe is in Vermont, and it is nearing February in Vermont, which gets very cold. For anyone who's lived there this time of year, it can, you know, be as low as minus 40 degrees or colder. So rather than being trapped inside with a bunch of highly noxious fumes, doing his goop head and tying through one of these flies, I believe he's got a number of different flies right there that we're going to walk through. And then at the end, was I understanding you correctly? You were going to walk through how to make those heads and what you feel like works from a tying overview and theory perspective?
Yes, I do want to make it clear that I think that the glues that I make these fly heads from are fairly toxic, and I like to be pretty cautious about what sort of ventilation situation. Usually I have a fan blowing on me with outdoor air when I work I work very close hand to hand. I don't wear any gloves, which I don't know if that's a, you know, safe recommendation. And so I want to be upfront that there's, you know, a safety precaution level that I'd like to put forth before describing making these flies out of this glue that I'm doing. And, you know, the flies look really cool, and I'm, you know, and I know a lot of people are interested in doing this. And so that's, you know, if you're going to do it, that's just the first thing that I want to stress is be safe about doing it, and do it so you are not sitting there soaking up the, you know, the fumes from these glues that at first I wasn't using the right amount of, you know, air circulation. You definitely catch a pretty serious buzz working with this stuff that doesn't seem like the good type of buzz that you want to be catching if you've done it a few times.
So no huffing. No huffing is the disclaimer here. This is a highly recommend in a well ventilated area, or you know, we can look and dig up and see if there are any non-toxic silicone alternatives. But thank you for that. And so you talked about, you know, those 80 millimeter big game shanks. we've been playing with tying some stuff on long shank. So it's definitely an area that I think is less tapped into than, game changers are all their age right now. And I think we've all seen that. But where, I know a lot of us got our background, some of us started gear fishing originally before, diving down the rabbit hole, fly fishing. And are you modeling this off of a lure, or what are you doing there?
Yes, and I have thrown this name around a little bit in the past in social media, maybe, that my flies, these single shank flies, when I started tying with the style that I'll describe here, it's kind of a framework to build any number of things around to get a certain action, that the Suick Musky Thriller, which is a big single block stick bait that is just a single solid block of wood with certain balance points, with usually 3 hooks hanging off of it, that has just slayed so many muskies. And a few years ago, I remember being at someone's house who had old musky, I think Musky Hunter magazines, or no, Muskies Incorporated, and it had a whole list of the longest fish caught by Muskies Inc. members for a certain period of time. And that was this was before I did this. The Suick was something that just came up over and over for these, well over 50-inch fish that these people were catching. And so, I knew that there was something to this concept of, how that stick bait worked the right way, what that could do to get those big fish to eat. And so the thing that stands out for me about what these flies do, and what a Suick or any sort of fly bait does, why that appeals to the fish, is that something that is injured for an apex predator, that concept always fishes. Some people talk about things, having to go fast, or speed being a critical factor. And in any environment, in any water temperature, the apex predators are programmed to track down and eat things that are highly injured and standing out from the rest of the healthy fish. And so the way I see it is, there are active muskies out there that are the ones that are, one in a however many fish that are just going to eat a fly, any number of presentations. Those fish that are just hot are, at times when you see some of these feeding windows, it's like they're going to eat almost anything. And then you have neutral fish that are not going to eat anything. And my strategy is to fly fish for the neutral fish, because you're going to catch the hot fish when you run into that fish that's musky, that's committing fishicide. And with the one that the guy who you're like, how did that dude catch one, is going to get caught by, that's not the fish that in my mind is the one that I want to put the stock in, why I do things a certain way. But those neutral fish that don't have any business biting the fly, that you might end up potentially catching with the right presentation.
So your focus has, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. Those are the fish that I feel like I'm making flies to fish for, are these neutral fish that are only going to go and eat something that really is acting in a way that is like, it needs to be, something needs to put out its misery, pretty much.
You triggered one thing when you talked about fishing glide baits, because if you're a pure fly angler and you haven't seen the gear world too much, some of these glide baits move in a way that is very, very difficult to replicate with a fly. And Joe's been well known for a number of years in the musky fly fishing community for being one of the people who has successfully done that. So when you start building on that shank, what are you doing? How are you building a fly that acts like a solid hunk of wood in the water.
Well,
Sounds easy.
the, just like with on a suic, or on any good balanced bait, where the hooks go on the bait and what the weight of the hooks are and how they interact with the overall balance of the weight of the lure is important. And when you tie on a shank, knowing what your intended hook setup is going to be and how heavy it's going to be is an important thing to know, because to create the overall balanced fly, what you basically have is like a teeter-totter. And when you put a certain weight hook on the back, if you want that fly to be balanced, you're going to have to do other things moving forward that are going to counter that, and that's from the simplest standpoint. And so with that weight in the back, the first thing that I think about after I know what hook I'm going to use, I'll just say the flies that I have here, all of them, they're all about 8 inches, 7 to 9 inches. A lot of my flies are trimmed flush in the back instead of having extended hackles, so they keep a certain shape. But within the size that they are, I use a pair of either size 3 or size 4 split rings off the back end of the shank. So I'll tie right up to a little loop at the back end of one of the fly shanks, and I will put a pair of split rings, and then I will use a debarbed treble hook. And
so you're linking split ring to treble hook?
Yes.
Okay.
And having the pair of split rings allows the treble hook to rotate around. And when a muskie eats, having the treble hook you use is going to be a small enough hook where it's not going to take all that much impact to get penetration. It's not going to be like the hooks that you need with a, let's say, 6 or 7/0 single hook. So when you have for me, I'm using a Gamakatsu tournament grade. It's kind of like a titanium metal blend, super sharp, keeps their sharpness, very strong hooks that I debarb them on smaller, lighter flies.
This is a treble.
This is a treble. I will sometimes clip one of the 3 treble hooks off and just have a pair of them if the fly is a little bit smaller, lighter profile, still on the same shank. If it's a fuller bodied fly, I'll probably keep all 3, and for the weight of that. And on the smaller, let's say and this is the one in the vise here. This is for me, that's a full bodied fly. It's not that much bigger than the one here next to it, but this is a fly with a little bit less volume. I would probably use the 1/0 treble with 1 clipped, and here I would use a 1/0 treble, just the full 1/0 treble. And I tie the smaller flies with a little bit less weight intended to balance with a little bit less weight. So knowing that is important. So knowing how much hook weight you have, the first thing that I want to do as far as stuff that you can't see in the fly, because it's a lot of guys tie musky flies that look like a good musky fly. And there's certain aspects to things that are underneath the fly that can make or break what
Absolutely.
the fly and how it potentially is going to catch fish. And really that the magic is in that part of the construction of the flies. I know a lot of people look at my flies and they're like, man, I'd love to get one of your flies because, I want to fish with it, and, I want to look at what it looks like on the outside, or, it seems like they catch fish because of what they look like on the outside. And to me, there's certain things that you can make a fly do that, just like that beat up old, wooden suic that's caught a whole bunch of fish if you get a fly that has the right shape and balance and fishes a certain way, I don't care if it looks like a sucker or a rainbow trout or a fall fish. I try to imitate certain things, but I've got flies that when I first pull them through the water, I can tell you how effective a musky fly is going to be.
I love what you're saying right now. It's interesting. I want to mention two things. If you ever hear us refer to a frog hook, that is definitely what I'm talking about, and that's from just talking with like Luke Swanson and stuff about taking a treble hook and cutting off a barb, typically to nest it in with the fly, not just for weighting, but it keeps that hook point from fouling up on those synthetic or natural materials. But then the other piece in the hardware platform. It sounds like, and I'm hopeful here that Joe's planning to walk through a little bit of, how he's weighting these patterns. But even if you're watching this closely and your goal is to mimic the weighting of these flies, make sure that you're experimenting with weight on these different hardware platforms, because that's one of the places where you really do make leaps. I think you're making an awesome point, Joe, how based on the balance and the placement of weight, whether that's turned dumbbells or lead wire wraps or channel lead or any other number, the times where you're focused on balancing the weight in a certain of a fly in a certain way, that is where the magic happens. I mean, if anyone, I would encourage, if you haven't, to try picking up a gear glide bait and seeing how it feels in your hand and how balanced it is. That is the concept that Joe is describing. So I kind of wanted to mention a couple of those pieces because I completely agree. Just the value of the hardware platform and the placement of weight is arguably far more important than the outside aesthetic appearance of a fly. It doesn't, yeah, you can build bulk, and there's flies that turn well with bulk. And, I think a Buford's a good example. Like, they do turn, but that's a much different purpose for, what you're trying to accomplish when you swim that fly. And I'm excited to hear more about how you're looking at it and what you've done and found to be successful.
So there is a concept that is, I think, getting to be more and more widely utilized, of putting like a foam popper into a musky fly construction or onto a shank. And for me, Eli Brandt is the first person that I, other than the things that I was doing, that was the first person that I saw with a commercial pattern. I think it's his Optimus swine that had a popper, slid onto some sort of the fly construction, which is a really, really effective concept to work with. And in my mind, that's the most basic form of it, is to take some sort of a cylinder and to put that into the fly. But that is a way that you can balance the hook point in the back end of your teeter-totter of your shank. Your hook is hanging down there. You can tie in, after you put in a tail of a fly, you can slide in a cylinder that would balance out the weight of the hook.
Mm-hmm.
However, you can do more than that. And so having that flotation in the back, if it was just a round cylinder on the fly, is when you pull the fly, the concept I think about is muskies always, if they're going to eat something, they're looking at it from below and behind. If you're not looking at your fly pattern of what profile it presents, as you're pulling it in between strips from below and behind, then you're missing the point of what the fly looks like to the fish. Because if you think of where the eyes are on the fly and what the cone of vision is for where the eyes are on a minnow, where the muskie approaches a minnow from when it's going to eat it is in one of the dead zones of where the blind area of where the minnow can't see. The more cautious fish, almost always, the big fish almost always don't react the first time they see something, take a look at it and set up on it. And fish that are right up on your fly, unless they're pressured fish, if they're right up on your fly, in my opinion, oftentimes are getting a better look at it than intending to eat it. The adult fish that eat the flies, you know, have a certain, you know, kill range. Depending on the water clarity, the more clear the water is and brighter conditions are, the longer the kill range is when the fish are actually going to eat. They won't be right up on the fly. Those fish are just like taking a look at. So I just jumped a little bit off of the flotation of a popper cylinder. That's the most durable way to do it. That's the easiest way to do it. It's not the most effective way to do it, because the popper cylinder is going to give you rise in one dimension. And with the right keel weighting, where your hooks are, and with how you can add foam, different types of foam, different amounts of foam, and different placements of foam can potentially give you another axis of movement of your fly for the fish to see that sets it apart from the flies that the fish reject. And that's the in the round movement. And the way that you can create that is you can create a distinct misbalance of weight, where you have not just of weight, but of specific gravity, I should say, because in order for the fly to want to come back to a certain orientation, you need to have not just weight wrapped around in the round, but weight squarely on the bottom of the shank and foam on the top of the shank. Which means that when you pull that fly and that fly does some sort of an erratic movement, in the period where it hangs after that movement, it's going to right itself upright, which is something that almost nothing else the fish see, except for maybe, you know, one of those perfectly balanced glide baits where the weight that's plugged into the wood, when you pull it with different, you know, tip movements, and the thing over moves in different ways and then rights itself between the hang, and the fish eat it on the pause. That's the same way to create this, you know, control of your axis of rotation of getting the fly to balance itself, which allows you to fish flies a lot slower with confidence that they're doing things that are fishy. And the colder the water gets, the more the ability to create a fly that will be fishy for a long period of time, and to be able to fish slow, your success rate goes further and further up the longer you can show these, you know, cold neutral fish something that's just, you know, acting in ways that you can't rule out that it's, you know, a natural thing. And so the thing that I'm describing, it's a subtle thing to see in the water, but then you put something next to it that doesn't have it, and you see the difference.
Instantly noticeable. I got to jump in real quick, just for anyone who's just joining, you know, this, maybe they haven't watched the rest of the series, or maybe they're just coming into this video now and kind of jumping around. This is one of the juicier conversations around fly tying theory that I have had at this point. So I want to draw attention to what Joe is talking about in destabilizing a fly pattern, and how that leads to an action that allows you to fish it effectively at different speeds and different conditions. The importance of that cannot be overstated. This is where the magic happens. So if you've been kind of just watching this tying in the background and, you know, maybe not paying attention to every single little thing, this might be a really good spot to pay attention really closely, because please keep going. This is awesome.
So there's been a few things that I have that I've used to to put foam up on the back of a fly, and I grabbed a fly, happened to have the last fly. I just caught a muskie on this fly before I clipped it off on the last outing with one of these hookless teasers attached to it, which is not something I'll try to delve into, just the fly construction, you know, without getting into that. But there's the pair of split ring, and you know, here's a full debarbed 1/0 treble that that's what I was throwing at the last bit of the season there or I don't know if it's preseason or postseason when you're fishing in January in the Northeast and getting them.
It's just crazy that we can just call it crazy and leave it there. I mean, that's well, how cold was it? You said you had football field size chunks of ice coming at you on the river.
There was enough ice on the river that it was a discussion of whether we'd be able to make it back to the launch once we had launched, because it was a high of like 13 degrees and it was gaining ice. You know, the first day that we were out there. And
so less than ideal musky conditions, but how'd that work out for you?
I hooked a couple of nice fish. You know, I landed a nice fat. You know, the females are all in great shape this time of year. I landed a fish that was probably 20 pounds. I did another fish about the same size. I lost just out of net range. But I hooked it way away. What?
It's good you're getting action.
Yeah, it was all right. I got a big walleye too.
Oh, fun.
So I was talking about the balance of the foam on the back of the flies, and on a lot of the flies I have, you can see a piece of foam on the back, and I've started to cover it up with glue, and so it's not as easy to see on a lot of the flies have the musky teeth marks in the foam. In my bag of retired flies here, I think I've got some examples of this.
How many muskies of the flies in that bag caught?
Everything in this bag has caught at least 5 purebreds.
That's awesome. They've
all had a lot of their tails nipped off. This one caught like a fish that was about 35 pounds, and I saved it because it was a unique shape. That one hasn't caught that many, but that one's caught maybe 8. This one with the really thin nose has caught at least 6. They're all banged up, and I don't have a good example of what I was going to show with a piece of foam in the back of the flies with the musky teeth marks in them. Although in this box of flies, I have some.
I like though that when you just pulled out a bag of retired flies that have all been proven successful. I mean, that bag just showed quite a bit of innovation. I mean, I'm certain that if you wanted to sit down and tie every fly and have it look the same, you could, but where's the fun in that? I mean, mixing it up and trying to accomplish different actions and different profiles. I mean, that's where the fun is. What would you feel like, I know you're going to keep going on your weighting and your foam on the back there, but what would you feel like is, what keeps pushing you to make modifications to patterns and trying to find something new?
I will say that I'll catch a muskie on a fly and I'll take it off and put another fly on, especially if I have a couple new flies that I want to see how they fish, and just to get a fish on different flies. Those retired flies are flies that I would let other people in my boat fish that I knew were consistent flies that just produce fish after fish until they were beat up, or flies that I would go back to in confident situations because I just knew that those flies that fish ate, you know, those flies. But everything in there is a fly that fishes good, and the building a fly that fishes good is, you know, there's a strategy to that. It doesn't happen by chance. So some of the attributes of the flies that I just started to describe, of having a certain amount of foam on the back of the fly that balances the weight of the hook you're using as far back as you can place it on the shank of the fly. That's a structural element. Beyond that, you have a couple other elements, and really the flies that I tie, lots of people could make flies that look, the colors and the shapes of the flies that I tie. Really, I think for the audience of people that are probably looking at this, a lot of aspects of my fly are within their wheelhouse of being able to replicate. And I don't, need to, talk about laying, some synthetics over deer hair and some of these things that, yeah, my flies might have nice tying techniques, but they're not anything that's beyond what lots of really good tyers are able to replicate. So if you have that teeter-totter effect where you have that shank and you have your hook and you're balancing it with foam, then there's a lot that you can do in the front of the fly, and you need to take into account the materials you're using, what the resistance and flotation of those materials are. And for me, no matter what I want to do visually, a fly needs to have a certain amount of bucktail or structure in order to have the water resistance that feels right for the way I want them to fish.
How much, just real quickly, that's a really good point about profile and structure and the amount of material like in holding a profile. But before we get fully past the foam to counterweight, so if you're using a 1/0 treble hook, clipped or unclipped, for someone who's never tied a fly like this before, how much foam would you be talking about to try to lash on the like length and thickness, or if that's an amount of information you're comfortable sharing?
Oh yeah. It absolutely is, and the determining factor, there's not a set formula for it, because I oftentimes am looking for lift and not just balance. And I'm taking into account the rest of the hair there, that if you took everything else out of play, that amount of bucktail in the fly is going to have a fair amount of lift. My flies are fairly dense intentionally with hair. They're not like really, I've tied flies like that they're not what I'm trying to do here. And so having that hair structure, it's going to float a little bit, but a lot of times I do want a fly that's going to have lift in the back, and in the round, it's going to be extra lift to counter where the hook is.
So when you say lift, you're not talking about an amount of foam that's going to like lift it when it pauses. You're talking about lift enough just to counterweight that and kind of experiment with destabilizing the keel portion of the fly.
I would start with the amount of foam that it takes to balance the hook from pulling the back end down.
Okay.
And work up from there. And
Cool.
I have, so, depending on how still the water is, how slow the current is, there's different presentations that I can make that sometimes, say if the water is high and I've got current that I can't get away from, I'm not going to be able to set up a certain really long, slow presentation. And so, I can't have a fly that has the type of lift in the back that I really need, a long certain presentation to present.
Yeah, that's helpful. And keep going. I'm sorry, I want to bring up a point about the amount of material you use, but I want you to keep going. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I get excited about this stuff. I really do.
I always want to balance the weight of the hook at minimum, and at maximum, I want to have enough foam in the back, or maybe potentially in 2 points in the fly, where as I'm fishing it, it is not just righting itself in the round, but it's lifting.
Okay.
and I'll as I say lift, as muskies engage to follow something, if you've got a sucker out in underneath a float, from the videos that I see, when muskies eat them, they'll almost always pin them against the surface when they are chasing around something that wants to be on the bottom. And the lift going away from a fish, especially if it's not right at the boat, even though it's, for fishermen, we want to see the fly right in our lap and potentially be able to, figure eight that fish, and fish react to that turn right near the boat.
As it lifts and pauses, sure.
But they react to that way better when it's not right next to a boat. And so
yeah,
that will do that, and you can stop your presentation and let that happen 15 feet from the boat. I've seen really big fish smoke the fly off the surface before the fly is fully wet, unintentionally, because the fly was lifting up away from the boat and then making flies with extra lift like that. It's definitely a concept that for fish that get a lot of pressure and everything comes back to the boat and, figure eights around next to the boat, using that escape angle, the vertical angle, which, in a little bit, maybe I'll talk about the other angle, which is the one that a lot more muskies bite on if you can set the presentation up the right way. But having control of that vertical angle, of having the fly lift up a little bit out of your control beyond the speed that you're stripping it back in, is a feeding, cue that is something that gets those fish that are pressured fish that see lures to bite. When those are the type of presentations that the fish that I've gotten my hands on a fair number of times, that are those big top end,
the ones we want,
water, northeast fish, that they've seen a lot of stuff. Those are the type of presentations, strange, things that the flies can do. That's not the normal stuff that other things do, that gets some of those top end fish to bite sometimes.
I love that. I think that you just hit the nail on the head of why fly fishing is such an effective tactic for muskies, especially in heavily pressured fisheries, right? I mean, even if they've seen a lot of stuff, you just hit on so many different nuanced pieces of fly construction that, it takes quite a while of time before a lot of folks even start thinking or talking about it. You said one thing that I really, really liked. I tried to ask you a simple question about how much foam you like to use. And I like that you didn't answer it with a simple answer, because understanding how your different materials interact and complement each other on the platform. You talked about using foam to destabilize things, but then how much material you're using on the shank as an element in that balance equation, and how it differs from fly to fly. Like, that is important in understanding while you're either trying a fly like this for the first time or modifying an existing pattern. I think it's really good to keep in mind. Out of curiosity, because I think, knowing how much you like to push the envelope and change nuanced things that have, been generally accepted principles, you're kind of like, I feel like we can improve on that and tweak it. Are you showing us teeth marks on the foam right now?
This does have a couple teeth marks in it. It's a newer it's a newer fly. I just tied before the last couple trips of the fall. But this is a thinner profile, smaller, narrow, what I call a dart head profile fly, and it has, this is, I believe it's 5mm sheet foam, which is like a Wapsi foam that you can buy in sheets. And this just has one block of it's not very big, and I think this fly actually is made to sink. And I make flies that are made to fish with intermediate lines or sinking lines that have different sink rates. This isn't the best example of the construction. I think that a little bit more foam than this allows a fly to balance the hook that I was describing. But there's one of the ways that I tie the foam in. It's just naked there on top of the tail of the fly, and the hair of the back of the fly is going to end up covering that right up. Where I use more foam, I've gone to covering it up with the glue and kind of some dubbing, so that fish that are following close can't see the open foam. But I will use about twice as much to 3 times as much foam as this, wider and thicker, longer pieces of the foam right in the same place, right on top of the tail that's coming out the back end of the fly. Musky fishing, the thing that limits everybody is oftentimes a lack of confidence that the thing they're doing is likely to work, and how that ends up reflecting on what they're doing, and being able to target muskies where you can take some of the variables out of play as far as what you can have confidence in, is just makes all the difference in the world in being able to consistently go out, even though there's icebergs hitting your boat, put one in the net. This fly has 2 full 3/4 inch by 1/2 inch pieces of foam that a fair amount of it is tied in to make sure that it's secure. And this has grande size pearl estas that's wrapped over, where it's being secured with like 100D Vivis gel spun thread is holding down those 2 layers of 5mm. In this case, it's brown, fairly dense, but I believe from Wapsi or this is just commercially available, big size sheet foam. There's 2 layers of it. It's brown on a fly that has an otherwise brown back, and yeah, it's about the width of the head of this fly, and this fly is going to have a little bit of back end lift, just a bit. That's more foam than it takes to float that hook rig. So with a sinking line and a long leader, as that long leader sinks down ahead of the fly, and then the fly gets pulled down at the angle that it's going to be fishing, it's going to stay with the back end up a little bit. This one's also, the foam is on the back, the keel weight is on the bottom. So you have the effect when you do what I call an overstrip on a fly, where you give it more momentum than what it can handle. What it does next is based on the fly construction, and it's also based on what you do with the line at your rod tip. If you pull on the line and then you kind of settle back beyond the strip, versus if you pull on the line and you give the rod tip back to the line. And this is something that people who fish musky baits, certain guys will catch way more than other guys. And you'll watch those guys, twitching their rod tip or something, and you're like, this guy has some control of that bait that the other person who doesn't, it's like having a skill, it's like painting, or something, where when you develop the feel response for what a certain type of bait or even a certain bait does, you can begin to have a control of what it does. And if you fish in clear water, or in water where as your fly comes back into view, for me, even though I have, I catch a lot of them and I have pretty good control of what my fly does when it's out of view, it always helps me understand how the fly is going to fish best when I see it. And then I fish it watching it. And I think it's important to consider how you can create that presentation that you think is the fishiest presentation with your fly when you can't see it. But but beyond that, I'm talking about when you're twitching the fly, I suggest when you pull the fly on a twitch that you have the habit of pulling it and giving slack back to the fly. It'll give the
Let it
fly
work a little bit.
more
Yeah.
room to work. But what the fly does is based on how much weight there is and where it is. And, within that single shank, if your weight is in the middle, that's going to be your axis of rotation. So when you pull a fly hard and your keel weight is in the middle, it's going to do this classic jackknife that's kind of fishy, but pretty unnatural for fish that are, small, dumb, or really hot fish, just like a straight back and forth jackknife. Some fish are going to fight that. In my opinion, your neutral fish, your big fish are unlikely to really get turned on by that presentation.
I agree with that. We need more erratic than that. I mean, that's
not the presentation I'm looking for.
Yeah.
From the middle point of the fly, if you move the keel weight forward, you get to a certain point towards the eye where, depending on how heavy your weight is, your teeter-totter gets misbalanced to the front. And so if that's the case and your fly is over front weighted, it's going to do a certain thing that might be a little bit fishy, where it's going to really carry forward a lot more than the other type of, in the middle, it's going to, as soon as it kicks off center, it's going to jackknife. And then if you've got the keel weight on the bottom and the foam on the back, it's going to jackknife, and then it's going to right itself, which is pretty fishy, but you can do better. As it moves forward to the eye, it's going to carry way far forward, but it's going to nosedive after that. That's still a pretty fishy thing. I think that's a fishier thing than having the keel weight in the middle. And you might want to tie some flies that are going to have a little bit of sink. They might be flies that when you've got really heavy current or high water, you can fish those flies that have a little bit more sink and are going to stay down, stay in the strike zone. You want to have flies across a range of things. So that's at the range where, for me, some flies that do that are going to be good. I want that. That's not the ideal situation though. In between the middle and the nose, you get about a third of the way back on the shank. You get a position where you're going to get forward carry of the fly, and then you're going to get a light jackknife that, when you have the keel weight on the bottom and the foam on the back, that light jackknife and then righting itself, that looks a lot more like when a sucker or minnow is like really wounded. When something is kicking forward, is a little bit off balance, that is a motion that will appeal to a neutral muskie that's not going to chase down an active fish. But if something is like really presenting itself, it's like, all right, like I might be interested in that. Having that presentation and having the foam on the back and then the weight on the bottom and then the hook on the bottom, it is so much different than just having the foam on the back and having the lift. So what the fly does, the slower you fish it, it's going to do these things that, I definitely suggest trying using, foam just on top of the fly and see what that does for you. But overall, the balance of my flies, there's a huge other thing going on that isn't being accounted for otherwise. And it's not just the head made of the goop material, it's that underneath these heads, you have a big, thick area of spun wool. And spun wool absorbs and holds all kinds of water weight when it's in the water. So that if you think of having like a red Solo cup and it was sealed off so no water could go in, and you put it in the water and moved it around, or you unsealed it and put it in the water and it filled up with water and you moved it around, it would be a lot heavier when the water was inside it underwater. And the biggest factor that makes these flies, I don't know if it's the biggest factor, a critical factor that works with the balance of where the weight is and how they're going to move, is the water weight of these flies fishing in the water. Super heavy, even though these are only, you know, a 7.5 to 9 inch fly, they take on the weight of water for about a third of that shank. And with all that spun wool inside, which when you lift the fly out of the water kind of drains out about 75%, they're still pretty heavy, you know, based on that being the case. And it kind of comes out as you cast it. But you have that weight, and then you have this hydrophobic surface that you can potentially shape if you're doing it just so with the goop glue. And the way that I like to think of what is happening here, and as you can see, here's a fly that the head is, you know, is kind of cylinder. It's kind of it's a little bit shaped like a fish head. You have a whole bunch of spun wool that's trimmed to the shape of, say, the head of a sucker.
How would you say that behaves? How would you say that behaves spun wool versus like dubbing? Like say if you're using laser dub or some other synthetic like that. Like I realize they don't hold as much water, but I mean, do you feel like you get so much more out of a spun wool compared to a dubbing in a similar capacity?
The spun wool gives you a couple things. The spun wool, for one thing, allows you to create a distinct three-dimensional shape in a way that I think you struggle to do with dubbing. You know, you can really pile up dubbing and make some shapes out of it. Granted, I'm not taking away that you can make a head stack with dubbing. I'll try to make you consider some of what is, you know, happening at your line contact point. That is the water contact point of where the water contacts the fly is crucial to what the fly, the way the fish sense the fly. Because as something moves through the water, the part of the thing that's hitting the water is creating this hydroacoustic sound wave that the muskies are sensing with their lateral line. Mm-hmm. So when you have a Buford, you have this big ball of deer hair that's all these intricate fibers that aren't a solid thing, that as you pull through that, you kind of get this
thump. Sure.
Thumping vibration pattern. That's the glory of the Buford. The Buford creates that dull thump, but the fish are going to find it. It's not really a thump that imitates something that's struggling in the water, but it's enough of a thump that it gives it something, you know. And that, you know, I think even for a mother minnow for trout, you know, I think it's the same sort of thing when those flies kind of have a push water around, the fish can tell they are the fish can tell they're there. But what the muskies sense has to do with the way, the water weight of your fly. So when you have a fly that's like a beast fly that's all hollow and you pull that through the water, it feels nothing like a big bait fish. You know, it feels, you know, if it's easy for you to cast it, it's gonna feel like something that's not very significant to the fish in the water. You know,
it's like fish next to somebody throwing a gear bait, throwing a big glider. I mean, that thing lands like a 5-pound brick out in the water compared to your fly. It can't swim the same way. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, you know, fly tyers are often trying to take away the mass. And for me, you know, I intentionally try to build in enough hair and enough mass within the fly, because my flies aren't huge. None of my flies are going to be, I bet I don't have a 10-inch fly, that I'm going to throw all year. That's probably the max with the hackles in the flies, but the flies are made to be a solid meal that, from below and behind is going to be an interesting thing for the fish to eat. And
I want to interject one thing real quick, just because you talked about dubbing and how it moves compared to like a hollow type fly, or a Buford, what that hydraulic pump feels like to a fish's lateral line. I remember some of my early musky flies didn't like, when I did use dubbing on a head, it was kind of in the round. And very quickly like realized like that wasn't triggering eats, like what is going on. And if you are somebody that's using dubbing, building the bulk, like what you're talking about with the wool, that there was a reason I asked that question. But I'm going to come back to the heads in 1 second. One of our earlier videos, and we're kind of filming these a little bit out of order, but we talk about the amount of material. Like when you first start tying flies, you are inevitably, very likely, most people start with too much material on the hook shank. And then as you advance, there's this curve where you kind of swing the other way, and then you maybe try to see how sparse you can go and still keep profile, and maybe you'll swing too far that way. But inevitably, to your point on having a lot of material for a profile, you do swing back to saying, okay, I need enough to hold that profile. I need something that acts similarly to a solid, right? Like a bait fish that swims, and how does it feel and move? So back to dubbing, a couple of the patterns that we use dubbing. And the reason that I feel that they are successful and that they've worked as well as they have is because of a couple of things. One, the amount of it, the sheer bulk of it does have a bit of a water push feeling that triggers a lateral line, but there's also big eyes that compressed on it change the shape of it, such that if you look at some of these slicked back profiles, really do have a bait fish shape. And given the keel weighting and the amount of material and bulk in the profile, they do swim in a destabilized way that turn and shift. But the point that I really like that you made is the way that the material interacts with the water. And I think that this is, I'm going to let you run with it here in a second where you were going, the slide or the glide, or the way that when the material, when you finish your strip and you give a little bit of line back to let that fly works. Is this where you started to work in the goop head, or, have you tried with silicone? Like, how does that differ, like between those two slicking agents, if we want to call them that?
I hear there are some, I think my friend Alec Gerbeck at Umco is telling me there's like an aquarium silicone. I have not used, I haven't used any silicone myself that I think does the, creates the durable, clear, slick, hydrophobic finish that the marine goop glue that I use otherwise, but I haven't used everything. And, so I'm not going to rule out that there might be less toxic glue that, technology is wonderful. And hopefully that there is a better option of this. I don't know of a better option that I've used. I've ruined flies with silicone where they usually have like a whitish, once they've dried, a very noticeable collar between the material and the head.
Like, it gets opaque.
Yeah, and when you get, and it's not great about getting wet and drying, where this stuff, if you do it right, you can have a really clean transition between the, head and the shoulder of the fly. And I've got flies that have caught a whole bunch of muskies that you wouldn't even, be able to tell that, that they've been hit is by looking at the head, because that glue is like self-repairing. And I think the silicone is softer than
Cool. That's good knowledge.
So, but yes, I had gotten off topic there. Thank you for bringing me back to the wool in the heads, because if you want to make a head like this, you need to have some sort of a shaped structure underneath a matrix of nylon dubbing that you're going to put glue over in thin layers. And so these flies have very intricate colorations. And the material that I do this with, there's a few things you can do stuff like this with, but I'll give a plug to John Romer's Arizona dubbing. He makes minnow hair and diamond hair. They're these nylon blends that come in a whole wide range of colors. And because there are some nice natural colors available there, that's what allows me to make some of these suckers or fall fish or rainbow, rainbow trout color transitions, olives, creams.
So is it a wool dubbing, or is it the dubbing that you go over the spun wool with that supports the goop?
So you spin the wool, you trim the wool, you spin the wool right up to the eye of the fly. You trim it to the shape you want the head to be, and then you take your gel spun dubbing or your gel spun thread, and you take the dubbing. And let me show a technique here.
So you're almost veiling, similar to. I think I have an idea where you're going with this, but I want to let you do your thing for a sec, because this is the magic. And while you're getting that material ready, just recapping a little bit. Actually, I'll revisit a recap when you're done here. Just because, and this has been awesome.
This is an Arizona minnow hair. And so this material is like I believe it's strands of colored nylon, but it's got a fairly long carry. And so because it has this long carry, I can create like a tuft of it that if I wanted let's say I wanted to do the belly in white and then the sides in olive and the back in brown, I could take a tuft in each of those colors and put the tuft in, wrap the thread around it like twice, like as if you were going to spin deer hair, and then you can kind of smooth it back into place over that spun wool and bring your thread back around into the eye. And
so you're veiling your complex colors around that wool head shape before you get into it with the goop.
And in order to make a good goop head, you need to lay down enough structure of synthetic dubbing all the way around, and not just on the top and bottom, to have this kind of web of fibers all the way around that interweave with each other, and that urethane glue goes over it and dries. It sucks into the wool on the inside of those fibers. The wool pulls it in, and those fibers cling tight to that wool, and having the fibers kind of blend into each other all the way around is what makes that durable and what allows you to shape it. Because once you've put some of the goop glue on the outside of a nylon web of dubbing on the outside of that spun wool, after you've put 2 full layers of fresh goop glue over the area you want covered, within a few minutes, it will have sucked it into the point that you could go back and shape it a little bit or a lot. So
are you just taking a couple minutes then between coats of goop then, if you're doing that? So you do, you take your finger, you rub your goop over your first layer to get it around there. Then what, you give it like 5 minutes and another one? Or is this something that takes a little bit longer than that if you're doing a couple coats?
the first layer will get sucked up just about instantly.
Okay.
You don't want to use any more glue than the material can absorb.
Okay, that's good intel.
So, you want to have, like a paper towel next to you. And as you apply the glue, if you have any more than you think you need, don't let it get wiped onto the fly, wipe it off, and only use the glue that you need. And that's, where people make a mess is with excess glue.
Cool.
If you force yourself to starve yourself for glue and only use and make sure that you're not going over what you potentially need at a time, that's going to, save you from ruining a fly based on getting glue all over it. I'm not saying that your head is going to be good. When this is a tricky thing and it might end up screwed up for another reason, but if you are, sparing with the glue and allow yourself to do it in a couple applications, but do make sure that you get glue 360 degrees around in one layer initially. The way that I do it is I will have all the material in the places where I want it. I'll have whip finished the thread off and trimmed it off. And then I'll have my fly, and it'll look just like this, except it won't have the glue on it yet. And I'll take the tube of glue, and using the rotary feature on the vise, I'll make a bead of glue all the way around the eye of the hook. And then I'll cap the glue, and then I'll take my finger and I'll smooth, using rolling the vise around in a rotary, I'll smooth that glue, all the way around. And then I'll hold the material back, and pretty much right away the nylon dubbing and the glue and the wool underneath is kind of going to suck that in, kind of like a sponge. 10 seconds, you can take the glue and do another small bead around the eye and go and cover up the area that you just covered.
And then do you add eyes after that, or when do you add your eyes?
So that glue is strong enough where if you have, these are like the 3D living eyes, that if you have eyes that are already having adhesive on them, after a second layer of glue, you can just stick those eyes on there and they're going to stay on there. Cool. On this fly, there isn't any extra glue, but if you really want your eyes to stay on, you can do one more layer, just covering enough to go from the eye of the hook, eye of the shank, over those eyes. Don't want to do any excess glue there on the outside of the other glue. Starts to build up too much, you get kind of like whitening. But as long as it's a nice smooth thin layers that aren't clumping up or building up, you can do one more layer over the eyes, and that's going to make the eyes more durable. Or you can wait on that point and you have, 2 layers on top of the material. You can go in and shape it then. So you'll see this fly is flat as a pancake on a shank. It started out looking round as that when I put the glue on it, and then I flattened it afterward.
So when you say shaping it, you're not talking about trimming, you're talking about compressing or making it a little narrower, whatever your goal is for a given fly tie.
Yes, I would say that, I've caught more fish on flies that are shaped more vertically than horizontally, but both the ones that are shaped horizontally they cast like a knuckleball. Typically, they can be a pain to fish. The ones that are shaped vertically, which is more of a natural orientation for a fish, I've caught a lot of fish on things that are out of round either way. Here's a fly that was pulled out of that retired box because so many muskies hit it that the tail feathers were falling off. That's one that's tied You know, it's not crazy flat like this one, but it's, you know, kind of flat.
So let me ask you
And
this. If you were looking through your box and you had some flies with kind of a vertical profile, others with kind of that horizontal flattened profile, what would make you, I mean, beyond just colors and basics and whatever, what would make you maybe pick a, you know, a horizontal compressed profile compared to a vertical one? Is it just kind of the mood you're in, or is there something specific about a given set of conditions or scenario or water depth or something like that that might make you pick one of those profiles?
to be honest, in the last couple of years, I've gone from messing with the shape, making the shape as dramatic, and messing more with where the weight placement is and where the foam placement is. And so now, because the flies that are more cylinder shaped cast and fish a lot easier, and I think that I can make flies that are of optimal effectiveness in this format. So the where the keel weight goes, how much the keel weight is, and using multiple keel weights is something that the concept of the multiple keel weights with the foam in the back of the fly, it gives the fly balanced weight, gives the fly more forward momentum carry without having to have the nosedive. So I described when you have a weight that's enough to balance the hook in the back up in the front and getting the forward carry.
Mm-hmm.
You, for the amount of hook I had up there, if you put the weight a third of the way back with a 1/10, which is heavy, which is an extra large lead dumbbell, a 1/10 ounce dumbbell, that's, I think, the best starting point for creating a musky fly with a good fishy action.
Have you tried the channel lead yet?
I know what it is.
We got to get some of that in your hands. It gives you a little bit more leeway. You can say, oh, I want a 1/2 inch or a little bit, and it just seats right underneath the shank. It's good stuff. Keep going though.
Having just like having the foam and a cylinder on the shank versus having it on top, I think that having the weight in really concentrated areas, there's something to be said for that as far as the control of the action of the fly. And that's not to dismiss that the channel lead is something that has a place, you know, in.
Oh, so you're saying really focusing the lateral distribution. So rather than having weight that extends maybe further, you're saying having it in that very specific point on the shank is what determines your keel weight balance. You feel like you get a more extreme action out of having like you said, a 1/10 ounce dumbbell eye than something that's maybe a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch long.
I think it's easier for me to anticipate what the action of the fly is going to be like when the weight points are more centrally focused.
Uh-huh.
And I like that the dumbbell eye is a broad weight profile that's all on the underside of the shank. But for the flies that I put multiple keel weights in, a piece of channel lead across a length of area would accomplish the same thing that a pair of keel weights that were across a certain area is going to accomplish. And so, although I haven't used channel lead, that, you know, what you're describing would work for these. There's flies that I want to have really this glider effect where the fly is pretty balanced and it's going to carry forward a long way.
But I also like that you're distinguishing between the utility of having multiple keel weights and where you would see the channel lead playing, as opposed to, okay, we're destabilizing the rear with, you know, we're destabilizing where the treble hook's going to be or the stinger is going to be if someone likes a single point hook with that foam. And then we still have it, even if that's destabilized, we still, okay, just above center between the midway point and the forward part of the eye, wherever we decide we want our keel weight for a given action. I like the point that you're making though about how, okay, well, if I wanted something that was maybe going to have more of an extended glide, or something that was going to turn sharply and snap, what that difference might be based on the type of weight and the distribution of that weight. Because I think I'm hearing what you're saying, and correct me if I'm not. There are patterns, especially jigging patterns, where we'll use like the extra heavy dumbbell, extra large eyes, that's like a very forward jigging utility, right? That application. But what you're describing about having a very specific location on the shank for the keel weighting of the fly and how that interacts with the balance that you're using foam to intentionally destabilize. And then you're finding that sweet spot between the front of the eye and, kind of the 3/4 mark, let's just call it, just kind of finding that sweet spot for the keel weight. There's a difference in action that comes from that. So I like that you didn't just say, oh, I want to use that keel weight there because that's going to work well. You were like, well, that depends on if we're looking for something that's going to kind of continue on that turn, or if it's something that we're trying to snap and make erratic, and maybe we're floating it on that sinking line example. Or the point is that there's a place for all of it. And I like that this is such a dynamic conversation, that we're not speaking in it, this is the way this is in this spot. And it's every fly you tie is going to swim a little bit different, short of saying, okay, I'm going to put my weight in that spot, right? Like that kind of defeats the purpose of innovating and trying to change and find kind of the next big thing. So now this has been killer. What else? Because I want to be sensitive to your time, and I realize this is taken a little bit. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure that we, address or include in this segment that we haven't already broken down?
Yeah, so when you're looking at a fly from below and behind, whenever I get a bait fish in my hand, I do ice fishing, and I handle, things like a dead sucker. And I'm always looking at what they look at from the underside, and the just like, people will put the trigger points in a trout fly. For me, and I use red laser dub for these things, I make flies that have a hot point, a red ass, having bright red laser dub coming out the bottom end of the shank at the same point where the hook is going to be, and bright red, or sometimes pale pink colored throats. I pay a lot of attention to the gill areas, and having, some of the flies I'll do will have like this fly has orange fins, and this one's caught a lot of fish. Having the orange fins are orange bucktail covered in goop glue that's trimmed, but not even things that are all that intricate. Having just a red dot at the top nose of the fly. But I will say that a lot of flies that I've caught fish on have these red throats. That's definitely something that is a bite cue to fish that are looking at things from below and behind. They can just barely see it. It's something that when, fish are struggling, they're likely to have more coloration in their gill areas. And
so you're doing every single possible thing you can to give yourself an edge on a fish. I mean, like, from the hot spot to the, looking outside the box and different weighting. There's a part that I want to ask about here, and we can cut this out if you want. But I noticed your teasers. I remember seeing a post from you about putting in that little dangler teaser, and that you caught a fish with, I think, your first day out testing that. Is that something you'd want to elaborate on here, or do you want to save it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to elaborate on that. It's clearly it's something that other people have done in other ways in lots of, in lots of different instances in the fishing and fly fishing industry. So by no means am I, trying to take any, credit for concept wise of doing this, but the
If you wanted a
certification,
year or two, if you wanted a year or two for us to, leave the cat in the bag, it's the least we could do.
well, they're also attached to my flies, which, my flies have also fished pretty good with, on their own accord. But going back and forth, on really heavily pressured waters, I was just getting a lot more interactions and fish and moving more top end fish. I got to do it about 5 days on the water, and at times where it was on a couple days I did it 50-50 on and off my line, and was moving all the fish when it was on, going back and forth. So it definitely is not detracting from success, and I think that it seems to be so I use crimps. I use these really extra short AFW number 4 crimps on the and this is a hard fluorocarbon from Sunline that I'm using for leader material, but using the crimp, and I don't use a crimping tool. I just use like a pair of Knipex nippers, and I just squeeze the material, the crimp, down right into the mono, so it gets into the structure of the mono, and these things never, are going to fail this way. But that's the connection I would use without using the dropper tag flies.
What pound mono is that?
Sunline salt fluorocarbon hard salt FC. It's a cross between like a hard mono and a fluorocarbon.
So is it like a 150 pound test, or what are you running, just like numbers there?
No,
It doesn't look like 150. It looks pretty flexible.
It's flexible, but it's like a hard mono. Like a muskie won't bite through Mason 40 pound. It's just not comfortable to use. It's, having been in the fishing industry and line sourcing industry, whether a muskie goes through your leader or not, it's about the durometer, or the hardness of the material, more so than the tensile strength of it. Tensile strength of how much your material snaps really has nothing to do with, whether or not a fish's teeth go through it.
I'm asking about line diameter. Absolutely. Yeah.
This is pretty thin. This would scare most people, and it's because it's a hard mono and not like a soft fluorocarbon. If this was Seagar Blue Label in this diameter, most of the fish would go through it.
Okay.
I suggest, if you don't have a good understanding of the hardness of the material, if you want to use a thinner material, I don't suggest just using like light material bite guard.
In the interest of ethics, and I realize that that's its own can of worms on fluoro versus, mono versus wire, and we can save that for another day. But I do think that it's cool to get to see just the different terminal connections that folks are using. And yeah, obviously you have a much deeper understanding of hard mono and fluoro and what a muskie does, and, when and where you're going to break off. I mean, you've got enough muskies where you know right where that line is. I know that we're going to have a lot of members, of the community who watch this, who may or may not have a similar understanding, but we'll also have other people watching this that are like, well, maybe I should try this 50 pound mono I have in the other room. And I'm like, no. Like, let's just skip that and not do that at all. So yeah, maybe we include, a separate segment on that, but yeah, let's skip that piece.
I understand that's a sensitive subject. I don't try to push what I use. I'm sure you can see that. I don't try to push what I use on other people. I have a background in the industry that, you know, in my opinion, every mono that's sold should have another rating, a durometer rating, that's going to give you the hardness of how easily something is going to durometer. There's a certain, you know, scale for this. It's, you know, just
A good speed scale.
n-
We can call it that.
more, there's a certain hardness scale that's, I think it's mostly used for like measuring diamonds, but just like you could have, you know, an 80-pound, you know, you could have your cigar blue label, it would be like, okay, it's 80-pound test, and, you know, on your 1 to 10 durometer scale, it's like a 2.5. It's like soft as butter, the fish are going to go right through it, you know.
I like that. Yeah.
Or your gamma, your pink gamma 150 is the softest fluorocarbon ever. Like, fish are going to go through that.
Do not use that. Yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter that it's like that thick, it's like bubble gum, you know, hardness. And that's just not, because I guarantee you that Mason hard mono 40-pound is harder for a muskie's teeth to go through than 150-pound soft gamma.
Yeah, and if somebody's watching this and they don't know this stuff, right? Like, a lot of this is this is absolutely a masterclass in some of the things that we're talking about. If you find yourself not comfortable knowing where the line is on, you know, fluoro or wire, or whatever, use wire. Like, the notable wire is a really good place to start. And I mean, I alluded to a can of worms, and I'll only touch the surface of this, but, you know, it's controversial in the community whether or not somebody can use fluoro. Like, you know, there's a long time where people were using 60 and 80-pound fluoro as muskie leaders, and, you know, bite-offs do happen in those circumstances. And some people do make a case that, you know, of using those in different situations, but those are well-informed decisions. And especially for someone who's just getting into it, or for somebody who is fishing in fisheries with, you know, trophy class fish, you know, northern Minnesota come to mind, you know, the Leech Lake strain fish come to mind, where you're talking 50-inch plus fish, and you know, just to use wire and simplify things. And if you are gonna dive down the rabbit hole of using a different leader material, you know, why you do something like that is really important. But yeah, I actually like the way you're looking at that, Joe, and saying that maybe we do look at, as a community, especially as muskie and I was going to say musky and predator fly fishing, but musky fly fishing specifically is growing as a sport and as a craft. I do think that there's room for another metric and another rating system around the terminal connections that we use, because I think that they would simplify things quite a bit.
The saltwater community also benefits from this, where they're looking for hard monos in certain situations. And, you know, we just sell people, you know, this is hard, one company's hard or another company's hard, and there's no way of comparing that attribute in, you know, in a scalable, measurable way like we do with tensile strength. And a lot of times we're using those hard monos in a situation where the tensile strength doesn't matter, that we're using it for abrasion resistance in a certain instance, and understanding what the, you know, abrasion resistance and hardness and bite defense are all synonymous, you know, as far as a physical attribute. And understanding that aspect is as important as tensile strength in a lot of situations where we're blind, you know, where we just have a hard or not hard, you know.
Whether you're fishing for sharks on reefs, or, you know, some other species in coral and areas or muskies in rocky ledgy areas, or, you know, pike are a little bit different creature there, but giving it more context. And I think that that's a pretty interesting thought. Hopefully the right person is watching this and hears this conversation and says, you know what, I think we can do something about that. Because the more information and the more benchmarks we have as a sport, and as we are pushing the envelope of what existing terminal tackle gear, flies do, the better we'll all be for that as a community. I think it's actually a worthwhile endeavor for whoever wants to undertake it. Well, Joe, thank you very much for coming on here. This was awesome. I like half the time you're talking, I'm like scribbling down notes frantically, going like, oh, I'm definitely going to ask about this. And then you cover it. I mean, the amount of knowledge that came from a fly tying theory, and that may be what we end up calling this this segment. Anyway, this was incredible. Thank you very much for being here, Joe, and to everyone who watched this episode. As always, thank you for being part of Musky Town and for watching Tying with the Pros.